Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another edition of the All Out Leadership Podcast. We are now picking up with the story that takes place after the death of Absalom. And this is one of my favorite passages of Scripture. It's obscure. You don't really hear it taught much. But early in ministry, the Lord directed me to this passage and just spoke some things to me personally as a young person starting out in ministry, struggles that I was having. And I think this will be encouraging to most everyone listening because I think we all really deal with some of these same struggles. So I'm going to read a little bit longer passage of Scripture, and then we're going to unpack this over the next 3 podcasts and get some really important life application from it. 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 19. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, "Let me run now and take the news to the king, how the Lord has avenged him of his enemies." And Joab said to him, "You shall not take the news this day, for you shall take the news another day. But today you shall not take the news, because the king's son is dead." Then Joab said to the Cushite, "Go tell the king what you have seen." So the Cushite bowed himself to Joab and ran. And then Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, said again to Joab, "But whatever happens, please let me run after or behind the Cushite." So Joab said, "Why will you run, my son, since you have no news ready?" "But whatever happens," he said, "let me run." So he said to him, "Run." Then Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and outran the Cushite. So here's this young man. He's named Ahimaaz. He's a runner. He's a messenger. They didn't have cell phones back then, or they couldn't, teams one another, a message. So they'd have to physically send someone to run who could run fast and run long distances to bring news quickly. So he sees this is a very important moment. What a glorious job. David's got victory. I want to be the one to bring the king the news. Now, the runner, when the king was given good news, would often be rewarded handsomely with money and promotion and prestige. So there was some real glamour, so to speak, to being a runner, giving great tidings of a victory inside a battle. So he was really coveting another man's job. Joab goes, "You aren't the one to do this today. Let the Cushite go." So Ahimaaz kept pressuring, going, "Oh, man, let me go. And, hey, I'll just run behind the guy. I just, want to run." And then we see that he actually outran the guy and gets to King David first. And, we'll find out how that went. But my question is this, and this is the struggle that I had to deal with early in ministry, and even occasionally from time to time. How do you handle it when you see someone else get the job you wanted? How do you handle it when you see someone else getting to do what you want to do? And how about this? How do you handle it when you actually think you're better than the one who got the job? Let's take it a step further. How do you actually handle it when you are better than the one who got the job? Because he was faster. He actually outran the Cushite, who had a head start, by the way. So technically, he was more qualified, he was overqualified, and he wanted it, but he didn't get it. So what happens when you run a race that's not yours? See, we all deal with this struggle to be somebody else, look like somebody else, have somebody else's job. And the problem is most people come to the end of their life never having figured out who God made them to be because they were so busy being somebody else, running somebody else's lane, doing what somebody else was called to do. God isn't going to reward you for doing somebody else's job. God's going to reward you for doing what He called you to do. So let's read this rest of the story to see what happens when he gets to the end of the race. 2 Samuel 18, verse 28. So Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, "All is well." Then he bowed down with his face to the earth before the king, and he said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who has raised up their hand against the Lord my king." Then the king said, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant, and me your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was about." And the king said, "Turn aside, stand here." So he turned aside, and he stood still. Jesus is represented in David as a type and shadow. So when we read the story of David for the last couple years as we've gone through this, we continually see David as a type of Jesus. There's going to be people who stand before God, and he's going to say, hey, glad you're here, but go ahead and stand aside. And they're not going to be rewarded because they ran a race that actually wasn't theirs. They spent their whole life being somebody else, a great imitation of somebody else, and never really found out who God called them to be. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, therefore we also, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set or marked out for us, looking into Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. We all have a unique assignment, a unique calling. We're not called to be a carbon copy of somebody else. And when we spend our life running somebody else's race, we're going to stand before Jesus, and yeah, we're there. Yes, we're in heaven, but we're going to be standing on the sidelines while we see others getting the rewards because we never ran the race Jesus has called us to be. And you know what? Your race might not be as exciting as somebody else's. You might not like the scenery in the route that God has for your life. It doesn't matter. Be faithful with what he's given you, and you'll hear him say, well done, good and faithful servant. When I started in ministry, the pressure was to preach like the big preacher that everybody was following at that time. And I would literally sit even in our communications class where we all had to get up, and a couple times a year we had to have a 10-minute sermon and we had to preach. And I would watch other up-and-coming leaders, they would preach. And you could see who their favorite preacher was because they looked like them. They carried themselves. They would use the same hand movements and the same gestures. And I'm like, dude, be you, man. And I just early on said, I'm not going to be like anybody else. I had a mentor in my life who, if I said his name, you'd know him. He's pastors one of the biggest churches in America. And he taught me this. He said, when I started in ministry and I was starting in our church, I took 1 year and I didn't listen to anybody else preach. And he said, because I needed to hear my own voice. Because when he would preach, he heard other pastors. He heard other voices in his head, and he was trying to find his own voice, who God called him to be. And so he took a year off listening to other preachers. Now, it didn't mean he didn't study and grow himself as a communicator, but he wasn't listening to other people to study how they preached because their voices got in his head. And at the end of that, he found his voice. And again, he's a very powerful leader and communicator today because he found out who God called him to be. So find your lane and run it well. We're going to learn a couple more great lessons from the story of Ahimaaz next week.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.